The most dangerous person in the room is usually the one nobody notices. The Grand Senate chamber of the Galactic Coalition stretched nearly half a mile from end to end beneath a crystal dome filled with drifting stars. Soft blue light washed across thousands of floating platforms where senators, diplomats, and advisors debated the future of entire worlds. The air carried the scent of polished metal and recycled oxygen. Translation drones hovered silently between rows. Data screens glowed like constellations in the darkness. At the center platform, Senator Lasara Vane stood tall in flowing silver robes trimmed with the colors of her home system. Her turquoise skin seemed almost luminous beneath the chamber lights. Every movement radiated authority. Every word commanded attention. Beside her stood Ethan Walker. Human. 38 years old. 6 feet 2 inches tall. Broad shoulders. Plain black suit. No medals. No insignia. No visible sign that he was anything more than another administrative aide carrying data tablets and meeting schedules. Most senators never looked at him twice. Lasara certainly didn't. You misplaced the trade projections, she snapped without turning around. Her voice echoed across the nearby platforms. Several representatives glanced over with interest. Ethan calmly opened a tablet. They were moved to a separate file during this morning's revision, Senator. Excuses? No, Senator. Just information. A few aides nearby lowered their eyes. Nobody spoke to Lasara that way. Not because Ethan had challenged her. Quite the opposite. His tone carried no challenge at all. No frustration. No pride. Just calm professionalism. Somehow that irritated her even more. The debate continued. Economic disputes. Border negotiations. Resource allocations. The usual political battlefield disguised as civilization. Through it all, Ethan remained silent, organizing reports and quietly anticipating every request before it was spoken. Hours passed. Tempers rose. Then disaster struck the senator's presentation. A financial projection appeared on the central display with outdated figures. Gasps spread across the chamber. Opposing senators immediately seized the opportunity. Questions flew from every direction. Lasara's expression hardened. She spun toward the nearest target. Ethan, what have you done? She demanded. Those numbers were approved yesterday. Ethan examined the screen. No, Senator. Those figures were altered 18 minutes ago. Are you calling me incompetent? No, Senator. Then perhaps you're admitting your own incompetence. The chamber grew quiet. Thousands watched. Cameras rotated toward the confrontation. Ethan simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands folded behind his back. Lasara stepped closer. Her frustration boiled over. The gesture happened so quickly that several senators later claimed they almost missed it. She spat directly toward him in public view. Silence crashed across the chamber. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He didn't react at all. A small drop landed against his cheek. Slowly, he removed a white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped it away. Then he folded the cloth and returned it to his pocket. The corrected report is already uploaded to your terminal, Senator, he said quietly. Page 42 contains the verification trail. No anger. No embarrassment. No resentment. Just facts. Across the chamber, an elderly admiral sitting 3 rows away suddenly froze. His pale eyes locked onto Ethan's face. More specifically, onto the faint scar running along the human's jawline. The old officer's expression changed instantly. Recognition. Disbelief. Fear. No, he whispered under his breath. It can't be him. The silence lingered long after the debate resumed. It moved through the Senate chamber like a cold current beneath calm water. Most delegates returned their attention to policy discussions, but whispers traveled between platforms faster than official communications ever could. Ethan Walker stood exactly where he had stood before, reviewing schedules and updating reports as if nothing unusual had happened. That unsettled people more than the incident itself. Humiliation was supposed to leave a mark. Anger was supposed to reveal itself eventually. Yet the human showed neither. Senator Lasara noticed it too. 20 minutes passed. Then 40. Not once did Ethan glance at her differently. Not once did he hesitate when she requested a document. Every report arrived on time. Every correction appeared before she asked for it. The complete absence of resentment felt almost unnatural. During a brief recess, Lasara entered her private preparation suite overlooking the central chamber. The floor-to-ceiling windows displayed thousands of stars drifting beyond the orbital station. She removed her ceremonial gloves and exhaled sharply. "Why does he do that?" she muttered. Her senior aide adjusted a data screen nearby. "Do what, Senator?" "Remain calm." The aide hesitated. "Perhaps discipline." No, Lasara shook her head. Discipline has limits. She had spent decades in politics. She knew arrogance, pride, fear, ambition. Every species displayed those traits differently, but they always surfaced under pressure. Ethan remained unreadable. That bothered her. Back in the chamber, the elderly admiral continued staring at the human from across several platforms. Admiral Nathaniel Cross had served the Coalition fleet for nearly 50 years. He had witnessed planetary disasters, first contact crises, and wars that reshaped entire sectors. Yet his hands now trembled slightly against the armrest of his chair. A younger officer noticed. "Sir, are you all right?" Cross ignored the question. His eyes never left Ethan. The scar, the posture, the way he constantly monitored exits without appearing to do so. Memories surfaced that he had spent years trying to forget. Frozen skies, emergency transmissions, rescue fleets arriving too late. One name repeated through classified reports. Ethan Walker. The officer beside him lowered his voice. "Do you know that human?" Cross finally answered. "I hope it is not the same man." "What do you mean?" The admiral looked away. "Nothing." But it was not nothing. Across the chamber, Ethan felt the stare. He always noticed when someone watched him for too long. He glanced briefly toward the admiral. Their eyes met for less than a second. Recognition flashed across the older man's face. Ethan immediately understood. He gave the slightest nod. Not a greeting. Not a warning, simply acknowledgement. The admiral went pale. An hour later, as the session entered its final stage, a maintenance alert briefly appeared on several public terminals. Most delegates ignored it. System warnings happened every day inside a station this large. Ethan noticed it immediately. The message lasted only 3 seconds before disappearing. He studied the empty screen. Something about it felt wrong. Nearby, security personnel checked their devices and exchanged confused looks. Then everything returned to normal. Or at least it appeared normal. Ethan quietly closed his tablet and looked toward the immense holographic display suspended above the Senate floor. For the first time that day, a faint crease formed between his brows. Somewhere deep inside the station, hidden behind layers of encrypted systems, a locked file had just received an unauthorized access request. SUA, the request moved through the station like a ghost. Deep beneath the Senate chamber, hidden inside layers of quantum archives and military encryption, an automated security process awakened. Cooling systems hummed behind sealed walls. Rows of data crystals glowed faintly in the darkness. An unauthorized query had touched a file that had not been accessed in over 12 years. Most systems would have rejected the intrusion immediately. This one did something stranger. It paused, as if recognizing the name attached to the record. Above, the Senate session continued beneath the artificial stars of the Great Dome. Representatives argued over tariffs and trade routes. Reporters uploaded commentary to millions of worlds. Nobody realized an entirely different story had begun unfolding behind the scenes. Ethan Walker watched the chamber from his usual position beside Senator Lasara. His expression remained calm, but his attention had shifted. He could hear the subtle changes around him. Security officers speaking into concealed communicators. Technicians moving faster than normal. Small things. Things most people ignored. The senator noticed his distraction. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the central display. "I am not sure yet." "That is not an answer. It is the only honest one I have." Lasara frowned. She still felt uneasy around him after the confrontation earlier. The memory should have embarrassed him. Instead, he behaved exactly as he always had. Professional, efficient, unshaken. It was beginning to feel less like patience and more like something she could not define. Across the chamber, Admiral Nathaniel Cross rose from his seat. His joints protested with age, but urgency pushed him forward. He moved through several platforms until he reached a secure communication terminal. His access credentials opened channels unavailable to ordinary senators. Pirate. SUA, the chamber lights dimmed automatically as additional security protocols activated. A faint amber glow replaced the usual blue illumination, casting long reflections across polished metal surfaces. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke above a whisper. The massive display suspended over the Senate floor continued processing data from a file that should never have been visible. Senator Lasara felt a strange knot form in her stomach. Only hours ago, she had viewed Ethan Walker as little more than an exceptionally composed employee. Now the entire Galactic Coalition seemed frozen by the appearance of his name alone. "This is ridiculous," one senator finally said from a neighboring platform. "He is an aide." Another delegate shook his head. "Then why is Joint Coalition Command involved?" A third senator pointed toward the screen. "Look at the classification level." More information appeared. Service status, active reserve. Special authorization, permanent. Override rights, confirmed. The whispers grew louder. Active reserve status was not unusual. Permanent authorization was. Ethan remained motionless. His hands rested behind his back exactly as they always did during Senate sessions. The only difference was that people were finally paying attention. They noticed the straight posture, the constant awareness of every entrance and exit, the way he instinctively positioned himself where he could observe the entire room. Small details suddenly seemed significant. Across the chamber, Admiral Nathaniel Cross lowered himself slowly into his seat. His face looked older than it had an hour earlier. Memories returned whether he wanted them to or not. Reports marked confidential. Rescue operations that ended in silence. Entire command staffs arguing over whether one human being could actually accomplish what the records claimed. He remembered reading witness statements that contradicted each other because nobody could believe the same events. Yet every investigation reached the same conclusion. The reports were accurate. Lasara turned toward Ethan. "You knew this might happen." Luke. The display remained suspended above the Senate floor like a second sun. Every eye followed it. Every conversation had died. Even the translation drones hovered motionless, their usual soft hum barely audible against the station's ventilation systems. Then the next section of the file unlocked. Numerical data began scrolling across the massive screen. Mission evaluations, survival statistics, environmental ratings, hazard indexes. Delegates stared in confusion until military personnel started reacting. One retired general visibly sat down after reading a familiar location. Another lowered his head and whispered something that did not translate. Senator Lasara watched the reactions spread faster than the data itself. "What are they seeing?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered. Ethan remained silent beside her. The screen flashed again. Service deployments verified. Then a list appeared. Karen 9. Ashfall Reach. Vortex Frontier. Black Ice Expanse. Worlds infamous throughout military history. Worlds most people only knew through documentaries and memorial speeches. The chamber grew colder somehow. A senator from the outer colonies leaned toward a fleet commander. "Those deployments cannot be real." The commander never looked away from the display. "Unfortunately, they are." More information surfaced. A performance tracker began loading. Normally, such records measured operational effectiveness through a simple numerical index. Most officers finished distinguished careers with respectable scores. Exceptional personnel occasionally reached extraordinary levels. The Senate expected another statistic. Instead, the screen paused. Processing indicators appeared. Then numbers started climbing. 100, 300, 600, 900. The count accelerated. Delegates exchanged confused looks. Reporters hurried to verify what they were seeing. The number passed 1,000, then 2,000, then 4,000. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices. "That cannot be correct. The database is corrupted. Run verification." Security technicians rushed through diagnostic procedures. Every result returned identical confirmation. The data was authentic. Lasara stared at Ethan. For the first time since meeting him, she noticed something unexpected. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Regret. The number continued rising. 5,000. 7,000. 9,000. The display struggled to keep pace. Processing warnings appeared along the edges of the hologram. Somewhere deep inside the station, servers diverted additional power to maintain calculations. Admiral Cross closed his eyes. He already knew how this ended. Years ago, analysts had faced the same problem. The system had been built to measure normal military careers. Nobody anticipated records like Ethan's. Nobody anticipated someone surviving long enough for the database itself to reach its limits. Suddenly, the climbing figures stopped. The entire chamber held its breath. A single line replaced the counter. Maximum trackable limit reached. Silence followed. Not ordinary silence. The kind that settled over a room when reality shifted beneath everyone's feet. Thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds stared at the same message. Senator Lasara felt her pulse quicken. She slowly turned toward the human standing beside her. The same man she had publicly humiliated hours earlier. The same man who carried schedules and reports without complaint. Ethan looked up at the display for a moment before lowering his gaze. It was never supposed to be public, he said softly. Across the Senate floor, nobody heard the sentence. They were too busy staring at the impossible message glowing above them. For the first time, the galaxy was beginning to understand that Ethan Walker had never been important because of what he had done. He was important because nobody had ever figured out how to measure it. The message remained suspended above the Senate floor long after the shock should have faded. Maximum trackable limit reached. It glowed against the darkness like an accusation directed at the entire chamber. Reporters stopped chasing headlines and started searching archives. Military officers exchanged uneasy looks. Younger senators quietly opened historical databases on their tablets. Everywhere, people searched for the same answer. Who was Ethan Walker? The file answered before anyone else could. New records began appearing across the central display. Not statistics this time. Testimonies. Mission summaries. Fragments of history. A cold wind seemed to move through the chamber as images from distant frontier worlds filled the hologram. Frozen landscapes. Storm-ravaged colonies. Emergency shelters illuminated by weak generator light. The first statement came from a colonial governor. Survival of settlement achieved due to unauthorized human intervention. Another followed. Evacuation successful. Civilian losses minimized. Then another. Rescue operation continued after official extraction deadline. Lasara stared at the words. There were dozens of entries. Then hundreds. None mentioned victories. None celebrated combat. Every record described people brought home. Communities preserved. Lives protected. This is not a combat file, she whispered. Admiral Cross slowly nodded from across the chamber. That is why the numbers never made sense. More records appeared. Ethan stood silently as years of buried history unfolded around him. He remembered each location, not because of danger, because of faces. Families waiting for transport ships. Children sleeping inside emergency shelters. Colonists refusing to abandon neighbors. The database continued revealing pieces of the past. One image showed a settlement during a months-long planetary winter. Another showed emergency workers unloading medical supplies beneath storm-dark skies. Everywhere Ethan appeared, he stood in the background. Never at the center. Never accepting recognition. Always helping someone else reach safety. A senator finally voiced what many were thinking. Why seal this? No one answered immediately. Then another document surfaced. Classification Review Conclusion. Subject attracts destabilizing levels of public attention. Recommend reduced visibility. Recommend reassignment to non-military role. A wave of disbelief spread through the chamber. The galaxy had not hidden Ethan because of something terrible. It had hidden him because his reputation had become too large. Lasara slowly turned toward him. You left all of that behind? Ethan looked at the stars beyond the dome. Most of it was never mine to begin with. People call you a hero. People survived. That is the important part. His answer carried no false modesty. It sounded like simple truth. The display shifted again. One final entry appeared. Personal evaluation. Subject consistently prioritizes civilian safety over personal recognition. Recommended for highest honors. Status, declined. A stunned silence swept across the chamber. Declined. Not once. Multiple times. The records showed repeated refusals. Promotions. Titles. Ceremonies. Ethan had turned them all down. For the first time that day, Senator Lasara felt something unfamiliar. Shame. Hours earlier she had judged him without knowing anything about him. Now she stood beside a man whose greatest accomplishments were measured not by enemies defeated, but by lives preserved. And somewhere deep within the station, beyond the attention of the Senate, a different system continued processing unauthorized activity. Hidden alerts flashed across secured networks. Security teams raced between control centers. Because while the galaxy was busy rediscovering Ethan Walker's past, Something dangerous was quietly moving through the station's present. The station alarms did not begin with noise. They began with silence. One by one, the corridor lights outside the observation ring faded to a dim amber glow. The gentle vibration that had hummed beneath the deck for weeks disappeared. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Daniel looked up from the maintenance console the instant he felt it. Across the chamber, Lyra was already standing. The silver patterns beneath her skin shimmered once, then went dark. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Something was wrong. A cold notification flashed across the transparent wall. Primary reactor offline. Emergency containment in effect. For a moment, nobody moved. Then distant footsteps echoed through the station. Fast. Panicked. The kind of footsteps people made when training simulations became reality. Daniel crossed the room first. His boots struck the metal floor with sharp, steady impacts. Lyra followed close behind. Outside, crew members hurried through the curved passageways beneath crimson emergency lights. A child cried somewhere in the distance. An elderly technician leaned against a wall, struggling to keep pace with the crowd. Daniel stopped immediately. "Come on," he said, offering his arm. The technician blinked in surprise. "You need to get to shelter." "So do you." Daniel smiled faintly. "One problem at a time." Lyra watched the exchange without speaking. Around them, fear moved through the station like an invisible storm. Yet the humans still slowed down for someone else. Even now, especially now, they reached the central transit hub minutes later. That was when the second warning arrived. Not a reactor failure. Not an accident. A debris field. Thousands of fragments from an ancient orbital platform had shifted unexpectedly. The station sat directly in their path. Impact projections appeared across every public display. The numbers were not encouraging. Several evacuation shuttles immediately began preparing for departure. Command personnel shouted instructions. Navigation officers argued over trajectories. Through all of it, Daniel stared at the holographic map floating above the command floor. Then his eyes narrowed. There was still a way to save the station. A dangerous one. The auxiliary guidance array had to be activated manually from an external maintenance platform nearly half a mile from the protected core. The route crossed open space. Automated systems had already failed. Nobody volunteered. Nobody even spoke. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Daniel stepped forward. "I will do it." Every face turned toward him. Lyra's heart sank. "Daniel." He looked back. The emergency lights painted one side of his face red and left the other in shadow. If that array comes online, the station can alter its position enough to avoid the worst of the impact field. The probability of survival is extremely low. "I know." The words landed softly. No drama. No heroics. Just acceptance. Lyra moved closer. For the first time since she had known him, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. "There are others better trained for external operations." Daniel shook his head. "Maybe. But they have families on this station too." Around them, nobody argued. Because everybody understood what he meant. The station was full of people waiting for someone else to take the risk. Daniel simply refused to wait. Minutes later, the outer airlock opened. Beyond it stretched endless darkness scattered with distant stars. The maintenance tether clipped securely to his suit. Frost drifted across the edges of the hatch. Behind him stood hundreds of frightened strangers. Beside him stood Lyra. She reached out and closed her hand around his wrist. Not tightly, just enough to stop time for a second. "Why?" she asked quietly. The question carried far more weight than the crisis itself. Why risk everything? Why choose sacrifice when logic offered safer options? Daniel looked at her, then at the frightened faces behind her. Because they matter. That was all. No speech. No philosophy. Just 4 simple words. The airlock doors began to separate. Cold starlight spilled across the floor. And as Daniel stepped toward the darkness, Lyra realized something that frightened her more than the debris field rushing toward the station. For the first time in her life, she understood exactly why humanity was impossible to measure. The outer hatch sealed behind him with a heavy metallic thud. Then there was only darkness, stars, and the faint sound of his own breathing inside the helmet. Daniel pushed away from the station and drifted into open space. The safety tether uncoiled behind him like a silver thread. Ahead, nearly half a mile away, the auxiliary guidance array clung to the station's outer structure. Tiny against the endless black, fragile against a storm of debris moving through the void. His suit display projected a route in pale blue lines. Estimated arrival, 8 minutes. Estimated mission success, 23%. Daniel smiled faintly. Those odds felt familiar. Beneath him, the station glowed softly. Thousands of windows. Thousands of lives. Families eating dinner. Children hiding in emergency shelters. Workers clutching each other beneath crimson warning lights. He forced his eyes back to the path ahead and continued forward. Inside the command center, nobody spoke. Every screen tracked his progress. Every heartbeat seemed synchronized with the blinking signal of one lone human crossing the darkness. Lyra stood motionless near the central display. Her hands remained clasped behind her back, but her fingers had tightened enough to leave pale marks against her skin. Around her, officers whispered calculations and trajectory updates. She heard none of it. Her attention never left the tiny figure moving across the station exterior. A senior commander approached quietly. The evacuation shuttles are prepared. Lyra nodded without looking away. Launch only if the guidance array fails. Your Highness. The commander hesitated. If the station is lost, your presence must be preserved. Finally, she turned toward him. Her golden eyes reflected the emergency lights. And what would I preserve it for? The commander froze. No answer came, because everyone in the room knew the truth. Titles meant little if there was nobody left to protect. The words spread through the command center like a silent shockwave. Several officers exchanged startled glances. Some of the younger crew members looked at Lyra differently for the first time. Not as a symbol, not as royalty, as someone afraid of losing another person. Minutes later, Daniel reached the maintenance platform. Frost coated the outer framework. The guidance array stood dark and lifeless, its crystalline panels frozen in place. He anchored his boots to the platform and opened the access panel. Immediately, warning indicators flooded his visor. Multiple relay failures. Power routing damage. Manual override required. Of course, he muttered. His gloved hands moved quickly across the circuitry. Training. Instinct. Experience earned through years of fixing things nobody else wanted to fix. Behind him, distant flashes of light appeared among the stars. The debris field. Closer now. Much closer. Inside the station, countdown clocks appeared on every monitor. 8 minutes until impact. 7. 6. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second. Then something unexpected happened. A transmission request appeared on Daniel's private channel. He accepted it. Lyra's face materialized inside the corner of his visor. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt strangely familiar, like those evenings beneath the observation dome, watching stars drift past. Finally, Lyra broke it. There is something I never told you. Daniel continued working. This sounds serious. It is. Her voice was softer than usual. The delegation was never supposed to study human culture. He glanced up. No, I requested the assignment myself. His hands paused. For the first time since leaving the station, surprise crossed his face. Lyra looked away briefly before continuing. Our government wanted reports. Statistics. Behavioral analysis. I wanted answers. About humans? About hope. The confession lingered between them. Raw. Honest. Unprotected. Another relay snapped into place beneath Daniel's hands. Power indicators flickered. One by one, sections of the guidance array began to glow. And did you find it? He asked quietly. Lyra's eyes shimmered beneath the command center lights. Around her, officers pretended not to listen. None succeeded. Yes, she answered. I found it in someone who never realized he carried it. The final relay locked into position. The entire array suddenly ignited with brilliant silver light. Across the station, emergency systems roared back to life. Engines awakened. Navigation controls reconnected. Thousands of frightened voices erupted into cheers. But neither Daniel nor Lyra reacted immediately. They simply looked at each other through a transmission crossing the emptiness between stars. And for the first time, Daniel understood that the woman standing inside the command center had never come to study humanity. She had come searching for something her own civilization had forgotten. And somehow, against every logical prediction, she had found it. The station engines awakened with a deep mechanical rumble that traveled through every deck and corridor. Outside, massive thruster arrays released streams of pale blue light into the darkness. Slowly, Almost imperceptibly at first, the station began to move. Inside shelters, families watched the status displays. Children squeezed their parents' hands. Technicians held their breath. Navigation officers stared at probability models that changed second by second. Then the first projections updated. Collision risk dropping. 81%, 62%, 37%. A wave of relief swept across the station like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Cheers erupted across command channels. Some people laughed. Others cried. A few simply closed their eyes and sat down, overwhelmed by exhaustion. But the work was not finished. Daniel remained attached to the maintenance platform while fragments of the debris field streaked harmlessly past at a safe distance. Tiny flashes of reflected starlight crossed his visor. The danger that had threatened thousands was fading. The station would survive. He finally allowed himself a slow breath. "Command, this is Daniel. Guidance array is stable." Applause erupted somewhere behind Lyra inside the command center. Daniel heard it through the transmission and shook his head with a tired smile. "You all realize the station saved itself, right?" "Negative," a technician immediately replied. The station had help. Laughter spread through the channel. The tension that had gripped everyone for hours finally began to dissolve. An hour later, the outer airlock opened once more. Daniel stepped inside, carrying a layer of frost across his suit. Crew members lined the corridor waiting for him. Engineers, medical staff, security officers, ordinary workers. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had given instructions. They simply came. For several seconds, the corridor remained silent. Then one person started clapping. Another joined. Then another. Soon the entire passageway filled with applause. Daniel froze. Embarrassment crossed his face instantly. "Please stop." Nobody stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Seriously, this is weird." That only made them laugh harder. At the far end of the corridor stood Lyra. She waited until the others gradually dispersed before approaching him. The emergency lighting had finally returned to its normal warm glow. Reflections from distant stars drifted across the observation windows behind her. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply stood there beneath the quiet hum of a station that still existed because people had chosen to trust one another. Finally, Lyra held out a small crystal disc. Daniel accepted it carefully. "What is this?" "A sovereign honor seal." His eyebrows rose immediately. "That sounds expensive." "It is not awarded for wealth." "Good. Because I definitely do not qualify." A faint smile touched her lips. "In 12 systems, it is reserved for individuals whose actions preserve the lives of others beyond personal obligation." Daniel looked down at the crystal. Tiny points of light moved within its center like trapped stars. "I was just helping." Lyra's expression softened. "That is precisely why it matters." Silence settled comfortably between them. Through the nearby observation dome, countless stars shimmered across the darkness. The same stars they had watched together many evenings before. The same stars that now reflected softly in Lyra's golden eyes. After a long moment, she spoke again. "When I first arrived here, I believed strength came from authority." Her gaze drifted toward the station beyond the glass. "Then I believed it came from knowledge." Daniel listened quietly. "Now," she looked back at him. "Now I think it comes from choosing kindness when nobody requires it." Daniel stared at the crystal for a second before slipping it into his pocket. "You know, humans are not nearly as impressive as your reports probably say." Lyra laughed softly. "Perhaps not." Then she glanced toward the families moving safely through the restored corridors. Toward the children laughing again. Toward the lives continuing because one ordinary man refused to walk away. "But sometimes," she said, "one human is enough." Beyond the glass, the stars continued their endless journey through the night. And for the first time in many years, the woman who had crossed the galaxy searching for hope no longer had to search. She had found it standing beside her, quietly pretending it was nothing at all.